I'd like to congratulate the Center for Northeast Studies and Policy Research on organizing this conference. Now, this conference has three themes: narratives, networks, and negotiations. My talk today will touch on all three. I will simply take it as an example of how we can study Asian societies in new ways. Here in Delhi, we're surrounded by Asia on all sides. From here, it's about 6,000 kilometers to Tokyo, 4,000 to Istanbul, and 5,000 to Jakarta. We are in the heart of Asia, and it is attractive to look at Asia from this particular vantage point. But today, we hardly call Tokyo, Istanbul, or Jakarta remote. And yet, this is how many of us look at places within India, such as its northeastern reaches. This tells us something about how we map Asia and Asian studies. As we all know, the idea of Asia has an enormously long and twisted history. It has been suggested that the ancient Greek word for Asia, Asia, derives from the Asuwa League, a confederation of states in western Anatolia in Turkey, around 1400 before the Common Era. It was a name for a constellation of power. 1,000 years later, Greek geographers and Herodotus linked it to the idea of continents. It became a spatial concept. 2 millennia on, European understandings of Asia remained complex and nebulous. For example, well into the 18th century, there were discussions about the inclusion of all of Egypt into Asia. Over the past few generations, we have seen a concerted effort to recast Asia, no longer primarily as an opposite of Europe, but as an arena of study in its own right. And what we are witnessing today is yet another twist, the dissolution of the concept of Asia as one of the cornerstones of the spatial, continental perception of the world over the past centuries, and the emergence of a new, more disembodied avatar of the term, Asia as a network, or a network of networks. One major challenge for Asian studies is to reflect on how to conceptualize and investigate such networks. One way is to consider InterAsian Connections, the shared histories and shared futures of different regions of Asia. It is especially significant to look at such mid-level connectivity today. We live in an era in which popular debates on social change tend to slide effortlessly into dichotomies between the global and the local. The concept of Asia is one of many ways in which to highlight the importance of mid-level connectivity. Therefore, it's important to stress that inter-Asian relations and connections comprise more than just intra-Asian connections. Asians have shared their histories and will share their futures with many other earthlings. Today, the question of who is an Asian is impossible to resolve. It should not be turned into a programmatic one. Doing so would get us into lengthy definitional squabbles about what makes people Asian in their own eyes or in those of others. Is it residence, ancestry, language, aesthetic sensibilities, food habits, or just self-ascription? And where do we draw the borders around Asianness? Do so-called Asian Americans qualify? British citizens with a Punjabi background? Africans settled in Guangzhou, China? Russians in Kazakhstan? Japano-Brazilians? Or even perhaps a person like me with 2 grandparents born in Indonesia? Perhaps a more useful question is to what extent all of us in the world are Asia connected. We know much about the vast and long-lived networks that historically drew large parts of Asia together. Such key networks sustained the spread of Buddhism and Islam, the creation of Sanskritic and Sinitic script communities, the rise of empires, patterns of mass migration, and long-distance trade. But these connections hardly provide the full picture. Focusing on them implies privileging some enduring connections, but taking less notice of how networks fragment and how they get severed. They also draw our attention towards the larger networks and sweeping interconnections, leaving us less opportunity to explore finer detail and more quirky connections. And crucially, these major inter-Asian networks bypassed parts of Asia. Local arenas across Asia provide us with clear contrasts in terms of their networking with other places and people. It is important to reflect on scholars' penchant to concentrate their attention on certain nodes. For example, earlier it was cores of so-called high civilization that drew their attention. And today there is a fascination with global cities such as Shanghai, Singapore, Mumbai, and Dubai, and a tendency to extrapolate dynamism and modernity from these nodes. People all over Asia are vigorously practicing the art of being cosmopolitan. Global Asia does not just live in its megacities. Rather than exploring these issues at a high level of abstraction, I would like to take you briefly to a fairly little-known corner of Asia. Let me begin by presenting you with a building that may be unlike anything you have seen before. We see religious symbols originating from West Asia or the Middle East, but seldom seen together there. We are in an area on the Asian continent that is routinely described as very isolated. National imaginings of this area constructed as exotic, remote, tribal, uncivilized, undeveloped, quaint, and inward-looking. Its links with the outside world are thought of as extremely restricted and certainly not inter-Asian, let alone global. So where are we? I've taken you to the northeastern margins of India. It is Mizoram, and it is a matter of opinion whether Mizoram is part of South Asia or Southeast Asia. I've chosen this area because it provides a local arena in which to test our ideas about what is important in the study of Asia and inter-Asian connections. It is safe to say that 130 years ago, the people of what we now call Mizoram were unaware that outsiders might think of them as Asians. The concept would not enter their world until Europeans arrived on the scene, and by Asian standards, that was remarkably late. What makes this area interesting is the breathtaking transformation that occurred here in the 20th century, and the many supra-local inter-Asian connections that facilitated that transformation. The scholarly literature on the region largely ignores these interconnections. Instead, it concentrates on the local, the universe of Mizoram, and the national, the universe of India. It treats the inhabitants of the region, today known largely as Mizos, as a marginal tribal society, either in search of joining the mainstream of Indian civilization and progress, or in opposition to Indian hegemony. The annexation of Mizoram to the British Empire forced a reorientation because it opened up vistas that were broader than the occasional trading and raiding connections that the inhabitants had previously had with direct neighbors. A British official who took the very first group of Mizo leaders to Calcutta, then the capital of British India and the second largest city in the British Empire, described their experience as follows. The magnificence of the city of palaces did not apparently impress them. On the whole, the balance of their minds inclined in favor of their own hilltops, where there were no mosquitoes, the plague of Calcutta, and where the ceaseless jostling of strange men troubled them not. To the Calcutta idlers, who came to stare at the wild men encamped on the Maidan, they seemed but a bandful of barbarians, with unkempt hair, clad in curious tartans, and armed with strange weapons. But to me, who had lived among them, and knew the nature of these men, and the authority wielded by them among their own people, it seemed a wonderful thing that I should have ever succeeded in persuading them to trust their lives in my hands. End of quote. Only 20 years after the colonial state arrived in Mizoram, that state appealed to its new subjects to volunteer for a faraway war. In 1917, 2,000 young men marched down to the plains to join the Great War in Europe. This exposure to the industrialized world made a deep impression and fired a strong desire to be modern in the European way. The British administrated these hills separately. Plains people were not allowed to settle here, and the language of rule and education was not one of the dominant colonial languages, Hindustani, Bengali, Assamese, or Burmese, but the Mizo language. Equally critical was the decision to allow Christian missionaries from Britain to live in the hills and to entrust education to them. For centuries, the Mizos had been aware of the great InterAsian religions of their lowland neighbors, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam. But they had never shown an interest, instead retaining their own cosmologies and spiritual convictions. But they saw Christianity in a different light. At first, the Christian connection focused Mizo minds on Britain, or more precisely, on Wales, from which many missionaries originated. But soon it became inter-Asian as well, with Mizos participating in vibrant Christian networks all over South Asia, and later with Mizo missionaries fanning out to China, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and well beyond Asia. Education forged previously non-existent connections with the colony of British India, as Mizo boys and girls went to Calcutta and Assam for secondary education, some staying on for college degrees. Soon Mizos were taking degrees in Britain, and by the 1930s, the first Mizo received his PhD in divinity from the USA. In the wake of the First World War, many educated Mizos found employment in administrative jobs, teaching, and armed forces all over British India. Mizoram was soon embroiled in another war, the Second World War, which forged connections of quite a different sort. One connection was the first encounter with Japan. By 1942, the Japanese armed forces had reached the borders of Mizoram, and for 2 years the area formed the front line of the China-India-Burma theater. Mizo leaders, like many others in Asia, were unsure whether to choose the side of the Japanese against the colonial rulers or to throw in their lot with the British. British promises of post-war freedoms made them side with the Allied forces. This decision had two long-term consequences, one political, the other cultural. Politically, the Mizo leaders distanced themselves completely from the anti-colonial nationalist movements in both India and Burma. They anticipated a future in which they would be free to choose their destiny themselves, whether to stay under British protection in a crown colony that would include mountainous regions of northeast India and northern Burma, or to join post-colonial Burma or India. The 15th of August 1947, the day that India became independent, was not a day of celebration in Mizoram. On the contrary, it passed in extreme tension. Pro-Crown Colony and pro-Burmese political groups decried it, and ultimately a compromise was worked out in which local leaders acquiesced in Mizoram joining India, but only for a 10-year trial period. Thus, the Japanese encounter contributed much to awkward relations between the Mizos and newly independent India. The Second World War also brought crucial innovation by offering a new model of modernity. The arrival of Allied troops in Mizoram deeply affected youth culture and initiated a lasting love affair with Americana. The two main symbols were the cowboy and the guitar. The romance of the Wild West translated into Mizo men dressing up as cowboys. Jeans, buckskin, large hat, and toy guns were everywhere. Popular music in Mizoram began to follow the vogues of American music: jazz, Hawaiian, rock and roll, folk, beat, and so on. In other words, the Second World War marked a distinct disengagement from mainstream Indian cultural influences. For example, the InterAsian phenomenon known as the Korean wave reaches its westernmost boundaries here, largely in the form of hugely popular Korean soap operas dubbed in Mizo. Thus, Mizoram provides empirical evidence about the modern that differs not only from European and American experiences, but also from those of most Indians. Mizoram's political and cultural detachment from India was thrown into sharp relief once again during yet another war, the 20-year Mizoram War of Independence. The Mizo National Army waged guerrilla campaigns against the Indian Army that soon led them to establish new InterAsian Connections. Unable to hold out in Mizoram itself, they established a Mizo government in exile just across the border in neighboring East Pakistan, today Bangladesh. Pakistan provided them with shelter, arms, and guidance, and several troops of fighters went to China for further political and military training. As Mizoram's political elite became personally networked to their counterparts in Islamabad, Dhaka, Kunming, and Beijing, the war dragged on until a peace agreement was reached in 1986, and the guerrilla army returned to a jubilant welcome. Mizoram became a separate state within the Indian Union, and the rebel organization formed the new government. I have suggested that modern Mizo identity was constructed around Christian religious markers. But by the late 20th century, identity formation took a new turn that resulted in the emergence of yet another unexpected inter-Asian link. Close reading of the Old Testament in Mizoram's ubiquitous Sunday schools had convinced a minority of Mizos that they belonged to one of Israel's long-lost tribes. They began to think of themselves as Jews and, as such, being entitled to settle in Israel. Synagogues sprang up, and once Israeli theologians had accepted their claim, several thousands of newly identified Mizo Jews traveled to Israel. In the religious universe of Mizoram, the dialogue between Christians and Jews also spawned completely new local religious forms, including the movement whose temple I showed at the beginning of this talk. I have briefly indicated moments in recent Mizo history that point to a multitude of long-distance connections, some short-lived and transient, others enduring. In terms of states, these connections involved British India, the United Kingdom, France, Japan, the United States, India, Pakistan, China, Bangladesh, Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, and Israel. If Asia is best thought of as a network of networks, rather than a continental unit, then the networks emanating from and passing through Mizoram can be appreciated in their own right, as well as in how they mesh with numerous other Asian networks, cultural practices, and collective memories. This approach may also serve another purpose that should be at the heart of the endeavor to promote the study of inter-Asian connections. Mizoram is situated in the corridor that links India, Burma, and China, societies whose relationship are strategically transforming. For example, Mizoram and surrounding areas are bound to be restructured if plans for the Inter-Asian Railway and Inter-Asian Highway are realized, and major gas and oil pipelines are already being put in place here. Like many other societies situated on the fault lines between the world regions that 20th century scholars have constructed to organize their knowledge production, Mizoram has fallen through the cracks. Routinely disowned by both South Asia scholars and Southeast Asia scholars, it appears as a peripheral anomaly, a misfit of little consequence. In a hierarchical construction of knowledge about Asian interconnections, societies like Mizoram have become of peripheral interest, and therefore scholarly ignorance about them is not considered a problem. Asia specialists learn to think of such societies as relatively unconnected and inward-looking, and it is precisely this perspective that can give an impetus to efforts to re-examine our understanding of inter-Asian connections. As we are shedding the continental straitjacket that has framed Asia research for generations, the challenge is to find the best balance between understanding Asia as a bundle of flows and as a collection of local spaces. Looking at the networks shaping these overlooked parts and comparing their interconnections promises to be a productive exercise if we wish to restructure our notions of what is important in Asian studies. In other words, our perspectives on Mizoram and surrounding regions must change. We cannot understand them as long as we take a Delhi-centric, Yangon-centric, or Beijing-centric approach. Such approaches are counterproductive because they construct the region and its inhabitants as remote without stopping to ask, remote from what? Is it from centers of state power? Is it from resources? Is it from mainstream cultural norms? Is it perhaps from democratic control of their own lives? Cultural condescension remains a powerful hindrance to the understanding of Northeast India and adjacent regions, now in Burma and China. Scholars of Asia and Northeast India could take a page out of the same book. The region is only remote if you take a perspective that makes it so. Never a good recipe for understanding a place and the networks and flows to which it is connected and to which it contributes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Schendel. There was a tour de force in you've lived up not just to your billing, but I think you've given us a lot of material to chew on, digest, and understand over the next 2.5 days. And I think this is going to really inform both our conference, our conversations, and our understanding of each other, the work we do, and the world in which we live. And you know, your focus on Mizoram as a region so intimately connected to the world, the challenging of assumption and cultural condescension, and that there is a learning in this process as well. I mean, there's so many other things. We've all been taking copious notes. But thank you for this and for privileging us with your presence and for the chance to really interact with you over the next 2 days.
In order to organize this event, the conference, so large number of the people were involved within the university and the outside the university. So I would like to just thank some of those who were directly or indirectly involved with this the event. Within the university, we are, the Center for Northeast Study. We really thank the administration headed by the Vice Chancellor of Jamia Millia Islamia. At the same time, we also thank the Henry's Bold Foundation for the kind financial support in organizing this event. And for this event, I'm especially thankful to Professor Schendel, who, despite of his very busy schedule, and who agreed to deliver the inaugural, the keynote address. At the same time, I'm very, very thankful to the delegates who comes from various parts of India as well as from outside India, and I'm also thankful to other guests who comes from within Delhi and nearby areas of Delhi. So for the next 2.5 days, we seek your support and guidance and the cooperations. So I hope that you will be with us till the end of this event. Thank you very much.